Hello, good morning. We are in Ayin Beis on page 1148, which, if you need the actual PDF pages, just go to ayinbeis.com. They're all up there. If you want to follow the text is in Hebrew. However, I obviously explain it, translate it, and explain it. So, middle of some dense material here. If I could sum it up in simple English, we're actually exploring, and you could even say dissecting, the earliest stages of how existence arises in the divine consciousness, in God's mind, so to speak. I know all those words, consciousness, mind, don't necessarily exist there, but I'm just using it as just simply to have some words. So it would be similar to how a human being conceives of any project or any structure, or writing a book, or we're talking about an artist creating art, or a builder building a home, that it doesn't begin with a final product. It all begins with a plan that's preceded by an idea, and the idea preceded in the deepest recesses of, I'm talking on the human level, of the human spirit and the human psyche. So if you want to have a parallel, that's the parallel. Obviously, the parallel is limited because we are created entities. We're not the creator. We're not the ultimate creator. But since we are created in the image of the creator, of God, so therefore our process somewhat mirrors God's process. As I've said a number of times, God does not have to have any process, but he wanted us to be able to understand and relate to him. Therefore, he created us in a way that our processes work similar. So if you spoke simply, forget about now, let's not talk for a moment God and creation. If someone asked you, you see a beautiful piece of art by one of the great masters, or you're listening to beautiful music, or you're reading a great book, or you see a mansion, a palace, everybody understands it didn't come there from nowhere. There's a process how it got there. So it's a product. We can call that the yesh hanivra, metaphorically speaking. It's the product. But how did this product get there? So we know there's a whole process and a whole assembly line that began somewhere. The closest we can identify with words, at some point, the producer, whether it's the author, the artist, the architect, or the business builder, whatever it is, at some point conceived of something. Question is, what precedes that conception? What was in his or her spirit before he even was aware of it? So you say, how could we know? Well, that's why we extrapolate. We know by seeing the result. Now, again, we're not talking about superficial things. If somebody, we're talking about a profound production, something important to a person. They built a family. They built a relationship. They built a home. They built, as I said, art. All of these things reflective of something deeper in the human spirit. And that's essentially what we're doing here. But we're doing it not just on the human level, we're doing it on the divine level, which makes it obviously much more complex and I would say even more abstract. So just to sum up what we've learned is that in the process, there's also a stage before the process. And especially when you're talking about God. With a human being, you can say, since we are, at the end of the day, no matter how great an artist is an artist, he's still a mortal human being. And in that sense, he's closer to the art than God is closer to creation. Therefore, you could say an artist, yes, there was a stage he wasn't yet a defined artist. There's a stage where he's an artist, but he doesn't have a defined one piece of art. All fine. But at the end of the day, even to go back as far as you can, he's a human being. He was born, and so on. I'm only saying it to make sure that the qualifications are in place. We understand. With God, on the other hand, There's a state where he completely is intact and complete as an atzmus. In the language we've been using, a non-existential reality, an absolute true reality that does not need to create art, has no connection with it, and there's nothing in common. So that's why it gets even more challenging. How do you figure out, how does a God that is so beyond it all manifest in states that he starts creating a relationship with existence and structure and so on? That's the only real distinction. Well, it's not an only, it's a major distinction. But beyond that qualification that I just made right now, there are many parallels to how something is conceived within the human psyche and develops all the way till it becomes a product. Just trying to give some language here that we can understand what we're covering here. And once you put it in this context, you understand the importance of this, because you want to have a relationship with someone, you need to understand how they work, how they function. So God is giving us, and this is what Chassidus does, is giving us a CAT scan, if you wish, of that process pre-tzimtzum, which means it's pre-production. There's no product yet. There's no production yet. There's not even a space for the product. It's all within the divine consciousness, if you wish, and beyond consciousness, that we're discussing is emerging. Now, we're never going to fully understand how exactly it works because we're not atzmos. We don't understand, even with a human being. Can you explain how the soul of a person is drawn to building a home or drawn to write a book? Yeah, we could say there's something in the soul that has some fulfillment when it does that. But it's very hard to say, because we've never visited that place. It's very hard to say exactly what is happening. But we do know something is happening. So the equivalent of that is pre-tzimtzum. There's a state of bilta mitzias nimtza, of atzmos beyond, and there's really nothing to say about that except that it's the absolute reality, and everything we know about existence, we cannot even apply to that. That's why we call it bilta mitzias nimtza, according to our definition of what nimtza means, of what faran of existence is. But yet, if you remember, we said we have ktsas musag, we have some understanding what true existence is through our own sense of mitziuse matzmuse. I don't want to go back there because we discussed that at length. I just wanted to just add that little note. Through our own sense of self-containment, that we feel that we don't identify with any source. We are self-contained reality, gives us some sense of what atzmos, what true reality is like. Okay. But to bring it back now, so how does the production begin? We have to begin somewhere. So Oir is the first step. Oir. I described it as a field of energy. It's basically God's ability and power to express himself in a existential way. What we call existence, that something is present, something has become present. What it is, it's still shapeless, it's not defined, we said it's not even revealed. But something has shifted from atzmos, has now manifested in Eir. Chassidus makes a big fuss about the fact that there's no shinui in atzmos when that happens, ani Hashem leishanisi, because it's Eir. Just like when light comes from the sun, there's no change in the sun because light comes from it or doesn't come from it. Now, obviously, the sun example is not complete. That always has to be qualified because the sun was created to give light, and the sun must give light. With atzmos, he does not must give anything. But one detail of the example that does work is that when he does give light, it doesn't affect his etzem. Okay. But now that we have this, let's call it field of energy, what happens next? That's what we're learning now, the stages, in the early stages of how that field of energy, I'm calling it that for a reason, because the best way I can describe what we're talking about, a Oir Ein Sof. So he described, and I'll sum up, I'm going to read just a few key lines. Okay, so he said like this. That's the first thing. That field of energy I just described, the core of Eir Ein Sof, it does not even in the realm of a relationship with Olamus. Here is a general word which means basically all of existence, everything that will be considered to be existent. Okay. Then there's Madregas, also in Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, Shem Bechinas Shaychus Aleilmus, that have a relationship. And here he said the two stages. He said, it arose in his desire. So that's some relationship. There's a desire, lahaitzil, to emanate. And there's yesham hashara. There's also the envisioning and the allocating of resources. Shir atzmei b'keach. And he says, so even that level that had no relationship with worlds, with Panimi, begins to have comes now into a state where it has some connection in a form of makif. Okay. And we explained yesterday that you can't say that this relationship or the beginning of a relationship is due to the pnimi, because there's no shaykhus to pnimi yet. It's all still an energy, a divine energy that's flowing. And within that, these are emerge these different states. That's what we explained. So now the next thing we learned, that Achba Emes, in truth, these are two levels in Ur. That the Ur, the light, the energy that has no relationship with the elements, Subchinis Era Atzmi, is called Era Atzmi, core essential energy. Shein Bechinis Hamshacha Ba'atzmi. Even within himself has not yet in any way extended itself. It's just there. It's just there. The only thing you can say is that it's not Atzmus. It's one step from Atzmus. But the Eir itself is not extending in any given way. I mean, I gave some examples yesterday. I'll just to give a little more example. Let's say the sun. Before light begins to extend itself, sunlight begins to shine. It takes around 8 minutes till it reaches Earth. So the sun itself is an entity. We know it's a luminary. It's filled with nuclear energy that's continuously generating light. And then there's the extension of the light as the sun becomes a source, and the sunlight shines from the sun to wherever it goes. Now I understand there's no hefsek. It's not like the sun goes to sleep and then in the morning it starts shining. It's shining all the time, different parts of the world. The sun never stops. But conceptually, you can define 3 stages, what I would say. The sun itself, the sun as it's going to manifest in light that will extend from the sun, and then the sunlight that actually manifests and is nimshach to the whole solar system for that matter, including Earth. So we can have an entity, the sun could have been a ball that doesn't give off light altogether. You have black holes, you have planets, you have many things that can be a full entity and it's not giving off, and there's no light. The sun happens to be a source of light. So you could identify light and distinguish light from the sun without yet saying that it's already extending to the outside. So it would be called more or less like the conceptual element of light. But you have to say that because you can't just say sun and thus the light is shining from it. The sun is manifesting in light. Maybe it's the light within the sun, like he says, so the first step is that the sun manifests in light and then the light extends. The same thing I said yesterday was, if you look at the Etzem HaNefesh, I was talking about a person that the essence of who you are is, we'll call that the Atzmi. It's Etzem. That Etzem, however, is going to manifest. The best proof of it is because from the soul will ultimately emerge faculties, will emerge a life force that energizes the body. So you have to say that the Etzem HaNefesh is not is it has is the etzem hanefesh. You have to say that it manifests in some form of expression, but initially the expression doesn't have shape and form yet. And then from that will ultimately emerge the expressions that we can identify with, all the way down to koiches gluyim, revealed faculties, the ability to write, the ability to see, the ability to hear, the ability to conceive, to feel. So you have the actual expression, which is the feeling, the mind, the intellectual, and you have the energy, the field of energy that emerges from the soul, and then you have the actual essence of the soul. This is how what he's basically saying. Obviously, again, when you talk Lamaila above, it's far more subtle and far more removed. So he's saying clearly that there's no hamshacha ba'atzmei. It itself is not yet subject to extending, but it's already so-called something in outside of, if you want to, I don't mean outside, physically outside of, but its atzmus has now said, I'm going to relate to an expression, but the expression hasn't happened yet. All that's happened is that a field of energy has emerged. So that's what he says. He calls that the highest level of atzmi. Let's go back to the word. That, yes. In other words, it's not the sun anymore. It's the sun as it relates to light. The nefesh, the etzem nefesh, as it relates to expression, but it's not yet extending itself. But the eir itself, the eir atzmi itself, is in a state of atzmi. I hesitate to use this because I don't want to use the word will, rotzen here, but think of a great teacher who lives in his own little world and studies, and he's brilliant and everything, but he has no real interest in teaching. He has no interest in relating to students. So what do you need to do to get him to relate to students? You need him somewhere inside his psyche to make that active decision that I'm going to not remain alone. I'm going to begin to teach. Now, he may not teach for years, but he's made that shift. He's made the shift that he's going to relate to others. And you say, is he relating to others? No. Within himself, he has decided, I'm not going to remain an atzmi. I'm going to manifest in a form of, well, I should qualify. With God, you can't say it doesn't remain an atzmi. He remains an atzmi. But I'm not going to only be an atzmi. I'm also going to have a relationship. But this is all within himself. There's no hamshacha yet. You can't say he's actually having a relationship. He didn't invite anybody to his home to learn, but the seed has been planted, so to speak. So there's an atzmi that's already oir. Oir means by definition extension, but it's not extending yet. It's only the conceptual step that's necessary to then lead to the next level that we're going to learn right now. I hope this helps understand it a bit.
Again, this is only in the oil, like we spoke yesterday, you said. Even what you said just now is only in the oil.
I'm not sure what you're asking. What do you mean only in the oil? Not where?
The atmosphere is above everything. But he also wants... Okay.
I mean, I gave so many examples. I'm not sure what you're asking me. What are you asking me? Whether Atzmus is oir?
No, you just now you explained.
I know what I explained, but I'm saying, what are you asking? Whether Atzmus is oir? Atzmus is not oir. Atzmus is Atzmus. But the oir is the first.
About the oil, right? The explanation that you said now about the atzmi is...
I just gave a whole example that there's the teacher, he's completely removed, and then there comes a stage where he makes a decision, or that he's moving toward a level of called oir. Yes. So
this teacher is in oil, right?
No. The oir is the connection to others that the teacher is going to start having.
No, but the teacher in the beginning, when he's not connected to anything, this is not talking about...
That's an example for Atzmus.
For Atzmus?
I gave a whole discussion. I'm trying to explain what Atzmi is. It's Hamshacha Mina Atzmus, but it's not hamshacha ba'atzmai, and it's not extending it. So it's the conceptual moving over from bilta mitzias nimtza to mitzias nimtza. But there's no expression yet. It's the determination that I am going to relate to other. Not sure. I think I explained it completely here. I'm not sure what the question is.
Because the Atzmus itself is not having the idea, like the teacher, that now I want to share.
That's exactly, where do you think the air comes from if it's not from Atzmus? I don't know, what are you saying exactly? Air comes from Atzmus. Atzmus has now imparted himself in an Oyer that's going to reflect from him, like the sun goes into the stage of Oyer. What is not clear here?
Not clear is that the Atzmus.
Why don't you talk to me about the mashal I gave? Let's talk. I said yesterday, let's talk about the mashal. I don't understand what you mean by Atzmus. I gave a mashal, the sun. I gave a mashal with a teacher. I gave a mashal with a builder, with an artist. Talk to me in the mashal. What are you asking me? Let's talk only the mashal.
The only thing that I want to know is.
No, I'm asking you only the mashal. Let's talk the mashal. I don't understand what you mean by Atzmus.
The mashal. The mashal is explaining how the Oyer Ein Sof is working. This is my question.
I don't want to talk about Oyer Ein Sof. Tell me whether the mashal is clear or not. Let's talk only
the mashal is very clear.
So do you have any question about the example of the mashal?
That's very clear.
If it's clear, so then just apply it now to how it is above.
I want to know what is the nimshal. Just tell me one word.
I said it 10 times. The artist, the etzem artist, is Atzmus. His connection to express art is Oyer Atzmi. And the actual expression of it is Oyer, is Ispasha Sa'ir.
Okay.
With all the qualifications that obviously God is not an artist and God is not human, but the mashal is helping. So there's the sun itself, Etzem HaShemesh. There's the sun as it's connected to being a moir, a oir. And then there's the oir that extends to earth. These are 3 steps. Etzem ha'oir, oir atzmi, and hispashtus ha'oir. That's what we're discussing here. Is that clear?
Thank you.
So he said, Be'emes, there are 2 levels in there. So we first covered, so it's only b'chinas hamshachim and ha'atzmus, aval ha'er ba'atzmei eina b'chinas hamshacha, ve'eina b'chinas gili klal. So there's the concept of oir, the field of energy, but it's not yet in an extension, and it's not yet in a revealed state. Ub'china zu hu ikir ha'er ha'kol ba'atzmosei. And this level is the primary level of oir. That when we say oir, that's encompassed in the core. But it's already the concept of oir. As I said, there could be the teacher who will never, ever have a relationship with anybody. So there's no oir kol ba'atzmusei. There's only the atzmusei. Same thing with atzmus. Atzmus, if there was no extension to the concept of oir, there would be no existence as we know it. In a logical way, obviously. So the first step is, there's the etzem, and there's the oir hakol ba'atzmusei. So it's already an oir in concept in relation to the etzem, to the core. Like I said, a nefesh that's now ready to be able to extend, but it's not extended yet. It has not expressed itself, it's not extended. All that you have is that it's capable of now extending itself. So you have, that's what Oyer HaKol Ba'atzmusei means. Now it's going to get a little more complicated with the parentheses. But I want to know if everybody understands what I've said so far, because before reading the next line, it's important that you have this clear as possible. If anybody has any question, please ask now.
Yeah, please. Ikar or, comma, which is kol ba'atzmusei. It's not the ikar.
Not comma, it's not a comma.
Okay, if not, it indicates, it implies there's other or.
No.
No, okay.
It's the ikra oir hakol batzmusay. It means,
Okay. That's what I was wondering. Fine.
yeah, no, I understand. You read that. That's not how you read it. You have to read it like this. B'chinazu, this level that is hamshacha from atzmus, but it's not hamshacha within itself and not gilui. He says this level is ikra eir hakol batzmusay. This is the primary definition of what means eir hakol batzmusay.
Totality. Good. Thank you.
The parentheses is going to be the qualification now.
Okay.
I'm going to give another example just to make maybe another little help as well. I mentioned the teacher, I mentioned all these examples, but let me give one more. I mentioned, can you have a relationship with a stone? A physical stone. Can you marry a physical stone? Can you have an emotional connection to one? The answer is no. Why? Because the stone was created in a way that's not lends itself to hispashtus, to extension, to relationships. That's not the role of a stone. Human beings who have a nefesh that's alive, have feelings, have thoughts, they are capable of having relationships. A stone has no relationship. So with a stone, you cannot say that there's a eir hakol batzmusay, because it doesn't need eir. It doesn't need to extend itself. A stone is not lends itself to shining or to illuminating or to extension. It is what it is, and that's it. I'm just giving an example of something is, but as soon as you see that a human being has the ability to express himself, right? I'm speaking right now. We can express ourselves in words, express thoughts, express feelings. What does that tell you? That the etzem nefesh, where everything is coming from, is conducive and lends itself to expression. That doesn't mean, however, that it begins with expression. So you have to say that the etzem nefesh has the etzem nefesh. It has the capacity to express itself. How do we know? Because we see there's expression. So if you see somebody speak, it tells you there must be something in them that allows them to speak. So the idea of eir hakol batzmusay is basically saying that God, completely removed from everything, is now exercising his ability to extend and have a relationship, which is not necessary, and we never know the reason why. It's Nesav HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the fact that he created existence tells you that somewhere in the earliest stage, Atzmus exercised that ability to become Eir HaKol Batzmusay. And that Eir HaKol Batzmusay will then become an Eir that will not be Kol Batzmusay, that will extend outward, Kavyachol, meaning not from God's perspective, from our perspective, and then go down through many gradations and a tzimtzum and so on to create existence as we know it. And then there's a full relationship. So basically, the extension outward tells you that there has to be an extension inward. So Atzmus moves into, moves, I don't want to say moves. Atzmus allows the manifestation of existential reality called Eir hakol batzmusay. And we'll soon learn more, but he's going to qualify that in Eir hakol batzmusay, there are two levels. That's where it gets complicated. So this is the parentheses. So here's what the Rebbe Rashab says. The Eina Kavona.
Would be correct to say that everything is kol batzmusay. Every expression was
Where do you
already.
see that? He's not talking about every expression. He's talking about Eir.
That's what I'm asking.
There is
Every
no expression yet.
expression had the potential to be expressed.
Yeah, but God is not, there's no expression yet. We're talking from the top down. I said when you see outside expression, it has to tell you that all the way in the beginning, there was the first step that the etzem chose to express himself.
So everything that's eventually expressed had its potential to be expressed. So it's.
I wouldn't put it quite that way. I would put it the way I just said, that Atzmus has chosen now to not remain completely and self-contained, but to begin the process of expression. And then that will ultimately extend itself as it diminishes to lower levels where the expression will be what we can relate to. If you're asking me whether Einoid Mulvade is God everywhere, is that what you're asking me?
I'm asking that everything that is expressed, everything that for sure human beings see and hear, had its potential, and like everything else, so everything is kolol batzmusay. Why would it be different than or anything else?
I don't know why you're calling it Kol Batzmusay. Why don't you just say God created everything?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the marshal also.
No, you're saying like this: God created everything. If you're saying God created everything, of course that's correct. But why do you have to use the word Eira Kol Batzmusay here?
I'm just asking if it's correct to apply the same words to everything, not just or.
No, you can't.
Why not?
What can somebody put on? There's some background sounds. Because only oil has that property, that being something that is completely bottled to God. What do you ask me? Whether a stone exists, kol batzmusay? No, we don't say that. That's why it's called a bri yesh ma'ayin. Oil is a reflection of what God wants. Creation is a whole different reality. Creations are creation.
Or is not yesh ma'ayin?
You're bringing too many different things here. What do you mean by yesh ma'ayin? Explain what yesh ma'ayin means.
No, because the rabbi just used those words. I'm trying to define.
No, a stone is called yesh. Yes, oir is called gili, etzem and ispashtus. A stone is called yesh ma'ayin. Chassidus makes that distinction. We learned about it at length in the last mimer. Yesh ma'ayin refers to something that does not identify a source. Oir identifies its source. It's connected to its source. So you tell me, however you define yesh ma'ayin, I'm telling you how I'm defining it. That's exactly why I'm saying it's not kol batzmusay. Because it's yesh ma'ayin. If it's gili helam or it's etzem and ishpashtus, that's a different story. So now he says, "Ve'ena kavona ala hakol batzmusay mamish." What we're saying here, the hakol batzmusay of etzema is not, the intention is not literally the hakol batzmusay mamish. That's why he said the words ikra hakol batzmusay, I believe. That level is a higher level. Shenikra shmoya kadman. That level is called the primordial name. So how do we distinguish the two? So he says, Ki'im, Mashaklolo Sa'ir, Shalifni at Simsum. What we're referring to here is not Shmoya Kadman. I'll explain, Shmoya Kadman rather. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Ki Mashaklolo Sa'ir, Shalifni at Simsum. The general light and energy pre-Tzimtzum, v'chein eira sevav b'chlal, and in general, the makiv, the sevav in general, hu eir hakol batzmusay, is the air that is encompassed in the core essence, ukiyadua, the air makiv eina b'chinis yitziyah min ha'atzmus, as it's known, the air makif, the transcendent energy, is not a yitziyah min ha'atzmus, it's not extended outside of atzmus. The primary thing here is that's etzem ha'er. It's not what he says, Shmaya HaKadman. Let me explain. Are you familiar with the concept of nefesh, neise keches? I don't. You remember that top of it where the nefesh is neisha. That a nefesh is created in a way that it carries the capacity and the potential, and the ability for faculties, but you can't call them actual faculties. It's just it has it, and the way we know it is because later we see faculties actually emerge. I'm using that as an example. If you're familiar with that, it'll help understand this. But regardless, let me go even a step back. The Rebbe explains when it talks about different levels of shlichus, and the same is really different levels of bittul, that you can have many different levels. And I'm going to go from the bottom up, and you'll see how this applies here. You could have a shliach, a person who chooses at his own volition that he's going to be a messenger or ambassador of the mishaleach, of the one that's sending him. What does that mean? That if the shliach, the mishaleach says, here, take this contract, or this star, this kiddushin, I'm making you a shliach to go bring it to my future wife. So al pi halacha, if the shliach accepts, he is like yad ha-mishaleach, he becomes an extension of the mishaleach, because you could argue, what do you mean? You're marrying her, I'm not marrying her. So you have to go. No, but there's the concept that Torah says that a person can choose and willingly delegate, and the delegator, the person who's receiving it, has to willingly accept to be my messenger. Now, if the shliach, for example, goes off and changes the shlichus, then he's no longer a shliach. He has to have a commitment to what he was charged to do. So that's a level of bittul. Why is that bittul? Because here you are a person on your own. You can do whatever you want. And here you've chosen, at least for this shlichus, I'm going to do something, the bidding of someone else, faithfully. So what do you have? You have two entities, two independent entities, I should say, and one has chosen to be an extension of the other. But there are many levels of this extension. It could just be this one-time act. He's a shliach when he does this, and then it's over. The contract is over. He goes back to his world. He goes back to his world. There's a deeper level where it's not just that you are essentially like an extension of the arm of the Mishaleach, that your whole being is committed to whatever the Mishaleach wants. This, for example, you find the Rebbe Shluchim. They're not just doing one-time job on behalf of the Rebbe, their whole lives. They've committed. So it's more than just one activity and more than just one act. It's an ongoing bittul. So that's a deeper level. But there's still two entities, even though we say shluchis shel adam k'meiseh on all levels. Because it could be even the first level, that person, when he gives the star kedushin to the wife, the potential to the future wife, he's shluchis shel adam k'meiseh. If not, it wouldn't work. He is now like the shluchis shel adam, the shliach is like the mishaleach in this act. But then there's a deeper form of it, where that shliach is now completely dedicated. But you still don't say the shliach is the mishaleach. No one's ever going to say that the shliach who brought the shtar kedushin is, in this act, he is. If his full life is committed to it, so then his full life, but he's still a human being who has his own name, has his own property. The most bittul dik shliach, you don't call him by the Rebbe's name. You don't call him a Rebbe. He's committed to the Rebbe, so the Rebbe works through him and his arms and legs and activities. I'm talking about someone completely committed. There's still two entities here. It's, however, a deeper level of bittul. Okay. I'm not going through every level the Rebbe explains because it's not, it's nice and relevant, but not, I want to get to a point here. But all this is still another entity committing to the Mishalech, the sender. which of course applies also to us and Hashem. A person can dedicate their life and say, I am ani nivresi l'shamish eskeni. I'm created to serve my Creator, so I am going to do what He wants me to do. That's a bittul. That's a bittul because you could also be a selfish person that does not commit. Then a person can go deeper, as explained in different places. The Rebbe explained, that there's nothing outside of that. So it's even a deeper commitment. Because the first way you could say, I'm created, but maybe I have a few things on the side that you do that are not necessarily completely committed, but it's not through and through. Then there's a level you're through and through completely committed, but it's all you, ani and kaini. But now let's move to another step. This is all you can say how an oir that is coming into the yesh of existence is instead of following your own intentions, you're becoming bottle. So the yesh is becoming like an oir that's bottled to its source. The question is to what extent? You could have bitla yesh, you could have bitl b'mitzias, you could have a bitl in some things, you could have in all things, it can be all of you. There's all kinds of levels. But it's still one entity being completely bottled to another entity. So for all practical purposes, this is all oir chutz la'atzmusei. But however, it's an oir that is bottled like sunlight that's outside of the sun, but it's completely committed to what the sun wants it to do. By nature, that's how it is. Now let's go a little deeper now. How does the Meshaleach see the Shliach? Meaning, from the perspective of the Atzmusei, how does he see this Oyer? So there's many levels here too. You could say the Atzmusei sees an Oyer that's outside of himself, but is bottled to him. You could see that Atzmusei relates to the Oyer as it's within him, but he relates to it. It's still two things, but one of them, it's like still within him, within his own being. He's relating to something outside of him. And then there's a point where it's only him and there's nothing else at all. So when you say, for example, Hayahu Shmei Bilvad, which is what he's referring to in the highest levels, Hayu Shmei Bilvad is the ultimate Eira Kol B'Atzmusei. Why? Because there, Shmei is just like Hu. There's not even an extension that we can say there's a Shmoi and there's a Hu. Hu Shmoi Bilvad. It's like the Shmoi that's Kol. So what would you say? In Atzmus, in the core Mishaleach, is everything that will come is there. So therefore, that's called the real Eira Kol B'Atzmusei. It's not even Eir yet. It's saying that whatever will come is Kol B'Atzmusei. In stage 2, which is what he's referring to here, that he says that the Kavanah he's talking about here, is God is already, Atzmus is already relating to an Oyer. So the Oyer is still all about him, but there's an entity called Oyer. It's not extended, it's not Chutz La'atzmusei, meaning it's not something that's already actively behaving in an independent way, or I would say in a way that's a functional way that's outside of the core. It's all within, but it's basically God is already relating to something. So essentially, there's two levels. There's how God doesn't relate to anything, and there, of course, he encompasses everything, encompasses also Shmoi. And then there's how God relates to Shmoi. So there's now Hu and Shmoi. Again, it's never, God forbid, two different entities, not a duality, but he's relating to something in a stage that is not just completely, everything is subsumed and absorbed in the essence itself. It's not an easy thing to wrap your head around, but you could understand it in a number of ways. We're seeing different relationships. So bottom line is like this. Atzmus, pure Atzmus, is removed from and relates to nothing. Even right now is that way. Then there's Atzmus as he chooses to relate to something. And that choosing to relate is still within him. Nothing else has happened except his choice to relate. And then comes the stages where the relation becomes what's called somewhat chutz la'atzmusei. Now let me explain. Chutz la'atzmusei doesn't mean, God forbid, that anything is outside of atzmus. It means the entity now is functioning with somewhat with a unique mission. It's like the shliach has become a shliach now. Up till now, the shliach is only a conceptual idea within the mishaleach. The shliach. So the oyer that we're going to learn soon, that is going to extend itself and ultimately go through the tzimtzum and all the way create existence, that oyer is still, obviously it's still part of, everything's kol batzmusei. But technically speaking, or I would say conceptually speaking, you call it an oyer that is now functioning with a function outside of atzmusei. Let me explain that further. We learned, if you remember, that all oyer, everything comes from the etzem. Everything is kamoya, everything is min ha'etzem, but not everything is kamoya etzem. So that's maybe a helpful way to understand the difference. What does that mean? Everything comes from God. Everything. Oyer, yesh, bri atzilus, bri yitzir asiyah, daimim tzameach chai medaber. Nothing, everything is hakol mimcha. Everything comes from God. So what's the difference between the one level and another level? If everything comes from God, the difference is some things carry godly personality. Meaning, even though God created everything, but not everything is reflecting godliness. Oyer is completely reflecting godliness. A yesh does not reflect godliness. A yesh is created by God. But if you look at the yesh, you don't see God unless you think about it and you work on it. And avodah, like we learned earlier. On the contrary, the yesh says, "Ani v'afsi eid, b'tzusim atzmusei." I don't need anybody. I'm self-contained. Yes, seichel tells us otherwise. But when you look at light, you don't need seichel. The light, right away, you see light, you see the source. So there are things that are, everything comes from God, but not everything is godly. That's why in Torah, there's a concept between the havdil, ben kodesh v'chel. If everything is God, why isn't everything kodesh? Because not everything is godly in a revealed way. Is it potential godly? Yeah, of course. That's when you mekadesh hachel. Chulin al taras hakedesh. Kol masach l'shem shemayim chol d'chechdei. If you take an object called chel, a mundane object, and you dedicate it to God, then you've made it holy. You've made it godly. But we're talking about not through avodah. Without avodah, some things are kodesh, some are chel. Shabbos, the kacha v'kaiman. No one has to make it holy. It's holy. The seventh day, when you look in the calendar, seventh day of the week, sunset, some holiness enters. The weekdays are called chel. Can you make chel into kodesh? Yeah, but that's not how it's initially created. Oyer is the epitome of godliness, not God. So you look at oyer, it reflects God, and that's why oyer is so vital. Because if you don't have oyer, we're not going to have a way to connect to godliness. If you only had atzmus, yesh amiti, yesh anivra, remember the whole point of the Ayin Beis. If you only had yesh amiti, yesh anivra, so yes, it's created by God, but it has no way back. Oyer introduces bittul. It introduces that you connect yourself like the shliach to the mishaleach. So now let's put it in the words that we're talking about here. Eir kol batzmusei is an oyer that is the only thing that's there is atzmus. But atzmus has chosen to begin a form of expression. But that's all you have. It's like saying the mishaleach has chosen to send a shliach, but there's no shliach yet. And he's definitely not started his job. Even his existence is not there yet. Then comes a stage that we call Eir chutz la'atzmusei. What does chutz mean? Not, God forbid, outside of God. It means its functionality is not just pure godliness. It's now, its function is to create what God wants it to create. So it needs to have a certain, like we say, Eir ha'chochma, Eir ha'bina. It's also Eir. All it knows it's chochma of God. It's God's chochma. It's God's bina, but it has the presence and the identity of chochma, which is exactly what God wants. So you could say Eira kol batzmusei is mina etzem and kamoya etzem. Eira chochma is mina etzem, but it's not kamoya etzem because God is a lot more than chochma. Oyer HaKol Batzmusa, you could actually say the true level, the mamish, that it carries everything God is. Chochmah reveals the Chochmah part of godliness, but not the Bina part. So yes, you say it's nothing but godliness, but you can't say it's all of godliness. So essentially, the highest level, the higher levels are an expression of, when you say kamoya etzem, that's what he's going to say after the parentheses. Shahu kamoya etzem. You see the word? I didn't read it yet. Shahu kamoya etzem. Whereas that is on a later stage will be mina etzem, but not kamoya etzem, because the etzem has a lot more. So essentially, when a shliach is sitting in his city and he's doing a job, he's sitting with somebody right now and giving them a class, or putting on a mezuzah on their door, or putting on film with them. He's a shliach of the Rebbe, shluchas lam kamese, completely. But his functionality, you could say, I'm doing what the Rebbe wants, but right now this function is one specific element, and it's chutz latzmuseh because it's not kol latzmuseh. So it's doing what the Mishalech wants, it's bottled to it, but it's bottled in a functional way that you can't say is within the consciousness of the divine. So it's the divine consciousness as it's extended into specific functions, essentially, another way of putting it. Now you could ask, will they ultimately all join together? Well, look, if we do the Aveda from the Prat, the details, we ultimately reach higher levels and higher levels. And yes, we could ultimately connect to the Eira Kol Batzmuseh, but you can't go there if you don't first start from the bottom up. But that I don't want to go into that right now, because that's the ultimate union of Das Elyon and Das Tachten. So, which of course is the whole point here. Das Tachten, you'll say, what do you mean Das Tachten? Is Das Tachten real? The idea that we have a perspective? God's perspective from within existence? Yes, because there's the God's perspective from the up top down as he sees existence, and there's how existence sees God. Both are godly at the end of the day, but they're very different perspectives. One is far more of a God looking at existence, and the other one is how existence looks at God. So you see right there, there's different ways to relate to this whole. And now obviously all these are necessary because this is the only way to understand an interface. If it was only Eira Kol Batzmuseh, we would never have existence as an independent consciousness. If everything remained on this level that we're discussing now, whatever, whether Eira Kol Batzmuseh Mamish or Eira Kol Batzmuseh Ikra that it's all still, then there's no room for another existence. It's all God has said, I am now going to have a relationship, but there's no relationship yet. This is going to have to go through more stages to create real relationship, because at this stage there's no relationship. All it is God connection, God's determination that he's going to relate in this way. Now, you could say, is this more relationship with existence than Atzmus alone? The answer is most likely yes, but you still can't call it relationship because it's still so consumed by Atzmus that even the Eir, Kol Batzmuseh, is all about Atzmus. It's not, the details of existence are not yet relevant. It's somewhat like what I said about the chief of staff. The chief of staff, all his job is to fulfill the king's will. That's what Eir is. All his job is, doesn't make a difference whether it's going to war or taxation or the post or planting gardens or communicating to his people. Chief of staff, the king tells him, this is what I want done. That's all he cares about. You can't have that alone. You need to have now the different heads of the departments. The one who deals with the mail, the one that deals with the military, the one that deals with taxation, every department. What do you need departments for? Because we're dealing with a structure. If it's only the chief of staff and God, then all you have is God and God giving instructions to his Oyer, what I want. And that's it. You need implementation, you need a world. We actually need an existing independent world to fulfill God's plan. There's no yesh here at all. There's not even an Oyer that relates to a yesh. So it's like asking a question, why do you need Elikim when you have Avaya? The answer is because you need the Oyer to get diminished, so there should be room for an outside entity to begin the journey of connecting to the source.
The chief of staff does have some leeway to make decisions based on what he understands the king wants.
Well, that's why the mushal is not perfect. It's only a mushal in the aspect that I said. Every mushal is going to have its limitations. In this case, correct. Oyer does not have any choice of its own. So it's in that sense the mushal doesn't work. The only reason it works is that it doesn't have any other agenda except what Atzmus wants, and he's not the head of a department. If he would go, the chief of staff would go ahead and start going and doing the actual activities, he would cease to function, his role would cease to be. So basically, Oyer's role is to carry, as we learned earlier, to carry and channel all of Atzmus's wishes into an existential reality. And the earliest stages of Oyer is completely part of the source. It's like the Oyer within standing in Yechidus with Atzmus, and that's all that matters. Then the Oyer will be instructed to go through stages where it begins to extend itself and express to others. That's going to be the lower levels. We haven't learned it yet, but he's going to say the next level of Oyer is going to be, the word he's going to use is, so let me see where we are here. Okay. Because since this is a very dense, if anybody has any questions, now is a good time. So the only line I would read after the parentheses would be, after he says, Eina kavana, ala eira kol batzmusei mamish. He says, in the ikir b'chinas etzema eir, meaning the ikir of eir kol batzmusei is etzema eir, which is lower than the eira kol batzmusei mamish. Shu kamoya etzem. It's like the etzem. So remember, when we say etzema eir, we're not saying oir as it's encompassed in atzmus, because that would be atzmus eir within atzmus. You're saying etzema oir, but etzema oir, its identity and personality is kol batzmusei. Whereas the other one is God. God has also the ability to do oir, but it's still mitzad atzmus. Here you're dealing with already something that has emerged, but it's completely consumed with what atzmus is. So it would basically be the two ways I would say it, if I sum it up in one sentence, would be the highest level of eira kol batzmusei is atzmus, how he sees the Oyer that can come from him. And what we're talking about, how its essence is completely only about Atzmus. So this already has the word Oyer. In the first one, we don't even call it Oyer. There's other places he says, Lav ihu nuhurin klal. You can't even call it Oyer because it's Atzmus, but Atzmus has the Yechelis. You could say it's like Yecholte lahoyer. Doesn't use that expression here, but somehow like that. His ability can do Oyer. So is it a connection to Oyer? Yes, in Atzmus there's that ability. But now we're talking about Oyer, and the highest level of Oyer is already something else, but it's Etzem Oyer, so it's all it is consumed with its source. And the lower levels of Oyer will start have a program in them that will carry the more details that relate to existence.
How could or be exactly like its source and still be very bittul, because its source is not bittul, Abish is not bittul, but how could he be both? I don't quite understand it. I guess maybe nobody does. I don't know.
Well, I would say Oyer equals bittul, not Oyer is bottle. Bittul, if bittul would look like anything, it would look like Oyer. So I wouldn't put it quite that way, that Oyer exists and it happens to be bottle. It's that God creates, God emanates a level that is completely dedicated to him. That's really what Oyer is. So frankly, the word Oyer is just for us to have some word to use. But if I were to define Oyer, Oyer means an entity that's completely dedicated to its source. So you're saying to me, since the source is not dedicated to its source, then where does Oyer get this bittul from? You see, you can't really say that. Of course, the source is dedicated to the source. That's Atzmus. So the bittul simply means that here's an entity that all it is conveying, channeling the source. So that's like inherent to it. It doesn't have to get it from anywhere. That's what it is. If it's not that, it's nothing. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I would say.
You answered it very well. Thanks.
So he says like this, Uka klal hayedua, I'll read one more line. Uka klal hayedua, like the known axiom or the known rule or general rule, the kol hakol ba'etzem, everything that's encompassed in the core, harihu kamoy ha'etzem. Kamoy, not just min etzem, kamoy ha'etzem. Everything within the core is like the core. I mean, going back to the shliach mashal, the goal of a shliach is to be a bar das b'fnei atzmei. If somebody was so bottled to the Rebbe that he could not go to a place and for 1 second think on his own how to solve a situation, he would not be a shliach. He'd be a bottle b'mitzias dikar chassid that belongs by the Rebbe all day and all night and can't go anywhere else. He's so bottled, he can't talk to anybody because there's nothing about him, doesn't have the ability to even speak, doesn't even have the ability to function. That's not the kavanah, obviously. So we need to have a level of oyer that's like that, a level of oyer that is completely, it's all it is its source. But we need to have also a level of oyer that's going to be able to relate and create that which has its own independent identity. It's still oyer. That's also God's will, and it's also reflecting what God wants. But God essentially saying that oyer, which is bottled to the etzem wants that oyer now to go to things that are not kamoya etzem, that are only mina etzem, but not kamoya etzem. So the etzem itself is choosing to create things that are not like himself. And then there are things that are like himself. Oyer would be a manifestation of God that mirrors godliness. And yesh, existence as we know it, is a creation of God that does not mirror God's. We're talking about conscious and revealed presence. So it's important to know that. Those both are necessary, which is why we need both. If you remember, we learned in Tzadik Daled, he said the mile of oyer is that's me'ena etzem, me'ena moyer. Oyer, mile is that it reflects and mirrors God, the source. And the mile of yesh is that it tells us something, what the kind of source it is, that it has that mitzisim atzmuse element. But that's not mirroring God. It's teaching us something about God. The creation teaches us much about God, but it does not mirror and reflect godliness in this seamless fashion. The kavanah is to have both. That we live in a world of yesh, that's its own independent thing. And it slowly, it acclimates itself and refines itself to become like oyer. When yesh becomes like oyer, you have, that's geula amitis v'ashleim in the fullest sense of the word. That you have a yesh that for many years in history has developed its own independence, and then it's become completely committed to the source by its own choice and avodah. Oyer, remember, doesn't have any avodah. That's how it is. God created Oyer. Oyer doesn't get any schar, any reward for being bottled. It's made that way. Oyer doesn't, it's not possible not to be bottled. But existence is a whole other story. Here we have the choice, and we can go in a different direction. And we choose to be bottled through oyer. Then you have the combination of the best of the two, both worlds. Okay. Well, we shall stop here.